Great. Okay. Welcome to another WAVEx webinar. I'm Melissa Hanson, Research Program Director for the Washington State Wine Commission. And this one is to prepare our growers for phylloxera before the season starts. We have both Dr. Michelle Moyer and Doug Walsh, who will be sharing today. So the first focus will be on the new risk assessment map that Michelle, Gwen Hoheisel and Abla Chandel helped put together, and they looked at soils and soil temperatures, and she's going to tell you how to use that map, how to use the resources that they've kind of pulled all together and put on a web page. And then Doug's going to follow up with what he's learned after 2 years of working research supported by the industry that's looking at various insecticide trials. Is there anything out there that can help sort of stave off? We know that insecticides won't eliminate phylloxera, but is there anything we can do to, buy you more time before you eventually have to replant on rootstocks? That's the goal. I don't really think Michelle and Doug need a whole lot of introduction, except, Michelle does a lot of extension work. And in this project, she wears her extension boots and vest, and she's collected a lot of samples, as has Doug, but she's been out, responding to a lot of grower questions, concerns. What do I have? So she's very familiar with scouting. She's put scouting videos together on how to find phylloxera. And then of course, Doug is our statewide IPM coordinator. He's our go-to guy for pests for grapes and hops as well. And I do need to remind everyone that we have 1 credit approved from both WSDA and Oregon Department of Ag. And to receive your credit, as soon as I finish my slide here, put your name in the chat box, and then at the very beginning, and then listen throughout the hour for a special code word, and we will tell you. And then as we conclude, as we start to get in question and answers, you need to put that code word, your name, and your pesticide license number. And that all goes in the chat box. We pull that download and share it with both WSDA and ODA. And they do read the time dates on this, so don't try to, sign off early. You got to stay for the whole thing. We've allowed a lot of time for questions and answers. And so as they come to you, rather than address them right, interrupting things, put them in the Q&A, and then at the end, we'll go through them all. And if you put them in the Q&A, everybody else can see them, so it can eliminate duplication. So that's the primary reason. If you put them in chat, it will only the panelists will see the questions. And so I have to toggle back and forth. So please use the Q&A. And with that, thank you. Just a reminder, these WAVEs are a joint effort between WSU and the Washington Wine Commission. It's our way to spoon feed the industry with research results that the industry helps support. So with that, I am going to stop sharing. And Michelle, you are up. Come on, there we go.
No worries. All right, just a reminder for folks to type your name in the chat box like Melissa asked for as a start.
I see we've got one, so
that's me. One more. I don't know. I don't think I count though. All right, thanks Melissa for the great introduction. And I know Doug will have some great resources for us after my presentation here. And I really wanted to highlight some of the work that the extension team has been doing on phylloxera since fall of 2019. And I really also, my name is on the title slide here, but really it's myself and Gwen Hoheisel, as everybody knows, who's also listening, so hi Gwen, has been really a very major key partner in a lot of the scouting and our extension and outreach efforts. So I do want to make sure she's given credit for those efforts. All right, so I'm going to do a very, very brief overview on phylloxera, because I know Doug will probably cover quite a bit of this as well, but I think understanding some of the things that were driving a lot of the extension and development of this map that Melissa mentioned, kind of giving you a background of what we were thinking about and using to kind of drive us forward in developing these resources for everybody here in Washington State. So first, why we're concerned about phylloxera, because essentially as an insect feeding on roots, it disrupts the root system. damaging vascular uptake of, nutrients and water. And so obviously, essentially it mimics what looks like severe stunting or severe drought stress on a plant. And so you can see that here in this picture. This is actually a vineyard in August. So you can imagine vines really shouldn't look like that in August. So with this phylloxera feeding, those roots get really damaged. And of course, if they're not intaking water and nutrients, the roots themselves actually die. And what ultimately ends up killing the plant is a lot of secondary fungi that come in and continue to destroy the root system. And so usually when you see a vine that looks like this, it probably was initially infested with phylloxera, probably a year, 2, 3 years prior to that. And really by the time you really start to see severe symptoms, phylloxera have actually already moved on from that plant because there's no more roots left for it to feed on. So unfortunately, by the time we tend to see something, damage is beyond repair. And that makes it really challenging from a management perspective. Luckily, or historically with Washington, phylloxera is really not a root pest we've really been concerned about. And for a number of reasons. One, we don't actually have any native hosts for phylloxera. So phylloxera is not an endemic insect for this particular area. We're pretty isolated, given both the Rocky Mountains, the Blue Mountains, and then just our kind of deserty type climate. And we have pretty severe cold winters, right? So when you combine that, when people were originally starting to plant out here, you had to weigh this option. Do we plant grapevines on rootstocks, knowing we may have to retrain or entirely replant, knowing that with cold damage, retraining gets really difficult if we're on a rootstock system, but we don't really have phylloxera out here. So you have that decision. Or do we plant on our own rooted vines because we don't have phylloxera, which makes it then really easy to retrain after cold damage. And so you can imagine cold damage is a real risk, as we all know from December and last week. And phylloxera was not a real risk. And so the decision at that time, when you're weighing your risks, you choose to go the easier route for managing cold damage, which is adoption of own rooted vines. And that's been awesome. It allowed Washington State to kind of capture market share pretty quickly. It allows us to quickly recover from vineyard damage. And it honestly has been pretty beneficial for the rapid rise of the industry in the state. But of course, it also comes with potential challenges. And that challenge is, of course, root-borne pests, including phylloxera. Some of the key things with phylloxera, though, is that it's pretty responsive to its environment. And given that the rest of the world has been dealing with this pest for about 150 plus years or so, we've really learned repeatedly as phylloxera has been introduced to new regions, what drives it and what doesn't. And a couple things that really kind of stood out to us when we reviewing, literally hundreds of years worth or 100, 150 years worth of literature on the insect is that it has an optimal temperature range, which is pretty normal wide range for most soil conditions. So that's like not super, super informative, but we do know that really warm soil and really, really cold soil hinder development in the growing season. You also repeatedly see popping up in the literature is that vineyards that were planted on sandier sites never really suffered from phylloxera. And in fact, there's still pockets of California and in France that have vineyards on own roots because they tend to be on sandier soils. And so that's kind of an interesting thing. And over the years, people have investigated that and have found that phylloxera really does have poor development in soils with really, really high sand content. And that's about more than 80% sand. And there's some moderate development between 60 and 80% sand. So you can see there's this gradient effect. And then really good development when you're in a clay soil or soil with really low sand content. And a lot of that has to do with just the temperature and water management that happens when you have soils of those different particles. And also there is some literature that says, oh, with big sandy soils, the soils can shift rapidly and crush the insect. Okay, I don't know if that, I'll let the entomologist weigh in if that's a true risk. But I think a lot of this predominantly probably has to do with the ability for that soil to rapidly fluctuate in temperature and available moisture. So in Eastern Washington, we have very fine soils, right? And so I think historically, and coupled with really, really large weather extremes between winter and summer. And so I think that probably drove our relaxed approach to phylloxera management, thinking, well, it's just not going to be conducive in the state. We have really fine soils, which we start to interpret as sandy soils, and we have these huge temperature extremes. But if you look at what some of the common soils are across Eastern Washington, we do have some sites that fall into that very poor development category of 80% sand. But a lot of our major soils are silt loams. And while they do appear fine, they're not sandy. So they don't technically fall into that low risk category. They are very, very fine. And so we perhaps overlooked those conditions, differences in soil types. Also, if you look through the literature, it's pretty common that most studies show that you get a peak of Phylloxera moving around and ability to find them kind of early spring into early summer. You get a break in the midsummer, and then you see a second peak in the fall. And that's obviously in 2019. We first really started finding this insect in the fall. And of course, as we started to scout for this insect, we repeatedly see this pattern every year. I can usually find quite a bit of Phylloxera scouting starting in about early to mid-May, going to about mid-June. And then once individuals start practicing regulated deficit irrigation, I usually have a harder time finding Phylloxera until we get back into the fall around the middle of August. So we kind of see that classic shift. And there's some differences in that, location and watering and soil management practices or whatever that change that process. So really, when we started thinking, when Phylloxera popped up and we started thinking about, okay, so how do we approach this? One of the questions mentioned was, well, maybe we need a risk map where people are going to have potentially have bigger problems with Phylloxera. And we kind of struggled a little bit with that, because when it really boils down to temperature and soil texture, well, there's a lot of things that influence that, right? There's how you irrigate. Well, that can change your soil temperature based on the temperature of your water or how much water capacity is in the soil. What are you cover cropping? How big is your canopy? All these things can kind of influence your soil temperature in the vineyard. So we were a little nervous that soil temperature might not necessarily be the best approach, because how do you even measure or monitor that is indicative of what's happening at your site? And then soil texture, right? So we have a lot of maps available for bigger parent soil texture for a location, but we do a lot to change that soil texture here in Washington, including a lot of soil amendments with the primary focus of increasing organic matter content or doing other things to structurally alter the soil. And of course, we also do a lot of continuous cultivation, both for particularly for weed management. And when we do that, that really breaks down that soil texture component and probably impacts how Phylloxera is developing. And in many cases might take what a site would normally be lower pressure sandy soils and maybe make it actually to a bit of more of a inhabitable environment for Phylloxera development. So the next question was, well, how do we map this? Will we figure this out? Where do we even start? Who should be looking for Phylloxera? Because remember, back in early 2019, we really weren't sure how widespread outbreaks were. And are we all going to suffer? And of course, if you read any of the news media going down, it sounds like the Washington state had literally and figuratively caught on fire with Phylloxera. And that really wasn't the case, right? Of course, it's clickbait to have a title like that, but that's not really what's happening. And so really, when we started getting the question of if we found it in one area, is it just going to rapidly spread across the state? And the answer is probably not. It's not really a fast moving insect per se. It needs to be spread in soil, and soil moves pretty slow. We have a lot of quarantine restrictions, both coming into the state and within the state. So that really does reduce Phylloxera spread. And as long as we keep following those quarantines, we could really potentially slow down the spread of this insect across the state and really keep it limited to where it currently exists. And that's where we decided to make a map. And the point of the map, I think, initially was to potentially describe where people might be at high risk for severe Phylloxera decline should Phylloxera be introduced. But I really think it ultimately became an exercise in understanding that in the end, most places, if an invasive pest gets introduced, it's probably going to be a problem. And really the map serves as a very bigger function to probably just really highlight that Washington is a lot of the vineyard sites in Washington are much more conducive for Phylloxera development than we probably originally thought. And so this map was developed by a postdoc, Avila Chandel. He was a postdoc for Dr. Lovecoat in the Center for Precision and Automated Agriculture, and Gwen Hoheisel was the lead on developing this map with input from Marcus Keller and myself, as we all bickered and argued over what types of components should go into there. Poor Abalash, as an engineer, is effectively indicating, hey, I'm an engineer. I need biometrics and data, and we're biologists, we like fluffy things. And so we had some really good discussions back and forth on how to share and to discuss a lot of this information. So we developed this map. It is available on our website, which I'll share a little bit more, but the map is primarily focused on soil sand content, as we described earlier, where we essentially divided risk into 3 categories: low, medium, and high risk. And if if the parent sands in your parent soils in your location have more than 80% sand, we define that as a low risk location. If it was between 65 and 80%, we define that as a moderate risk. And if it was under 65%, we define that as a high risk situation. We then took temperature and realized, well, you know what, temperature is an important factor, but if your soils are not conducive to begin with, temperature probably isn't that. Temperature doesn't matter. So if you're in a really sandy location, if your temperature is in the perfect optimal range, it doesn't mean you're going to be high risk, right? So we then moderated the value of temperature based on, or we then used temperature as a moderator for the sand risk content. So if you're in an area with really, really high risk based on what your soils are, but your temperatures are outside of that range, it lowered your risk level. And really, we have as a part of the map, we distribute a explanation guide as to how to interpret that. So when we say your soils, we combine what the sand-based content is of your location with what the temperature risk is, and then what your overall risk is, and then essentially how do you interpret that and manage that. So for example, if your sand content in your soils indicate you're pretty low risk, so you have over 80% sand. If you're also low temperature, we're probably not too concerned about phylloxera, provided you keep it out to the vineyard to begin with. So if it were to be introduced, it's going to not survive that well. Could still potentially survive if you're doing a lot of amendments, but it's really not that conducive of an environment. If your temperature in that location is good, it indicates that, yeah, you know what, hey, if it could potentially improve the site condition for phylloxera development, but really, you know, you still have to have phylloxera introduced, and you still are probably going to have to do something, amend the soil to really make it a conducive environment for phylloxera, which people aren't doing, right? So you're doing the opposite of that. And we have that kind of similar take all the way through. But the key thing I think we really want to highlight with how we phrased some of these explanations is it really emphasizes that phylloxera needs to be introduced to the site first before these risk maps are of value. They don't tell you your risk of getting phylloxera. This map tells you your risk of rapid phylloxera development should it be introduced to the site. So I want to repeat that. The map does not tell you your risk of getting phylloxera. That's entirely dependent on you bringing in plant material or soil or dirt that's already infested with phylloxera. What the risk map is telling you is, should phylloxera be introduced to your site, how quickly could it potentially develop? And essentially, you know, the time lag is essentially that it would take to severely damage the vineyard. So what does it mean? Risk does not mean infestation. You really do need to scout. So if you have an existing vineyard and you're in a moderate to high risk location, please sample for phylloxera. Look for distressed vines. You can do that either through just visual symptoms or looking at your NDVI images for areas of low vigor. And unfortunately, there really is no rapid or easy way to detect phylloxera. Doug does have a couple of techniques, but they're still pretty time intensive. So really, if you are in an existing vineyard site and you are in a high risk area, we do recommend to have a routine scouting program for phylloxera. If you are in a replant situation, of course, hopefully you can scout your vineyard to determine presence of phylloxera before you rip out. But ultimately, especially if you're in a high risk location and you are replanting a vineyard, you really need to consider the use of resistant rootstocks in that replant. So one of the other things that we're doing in all this process of developing this risk map is developing a series of resources for you guys to use in making decisions regarding phylloxera and rootstocks. And it's actually been kind of fun because this is one extension problem that's been done a lot in other locations because phylloxera has been introduced repeatedly over the decades and in many different regions. So we're not alone in this process, and we can look back at other regions like Oregon, like Australia, like California, and to see how things have unfolded as phylloxera was introduced and then how that system played out in those particular regions. So first and foremost, Melissa mentioned that we had a phylloxera web page. I'm going to leave this QR code up for the folks who have a smartphone. This page includes a bunch of resources and links to biology and management of phylloxera. It is also where you can download a PDF of that risk map in the risk map table and explanations. So please scan your QR code if you want to, or if you Google search WSU Phylloxera, that should be one of the top pages that pops up as well. The next best thing you can do when dealing with Phylloxera is to just scout to see what and where and how it might be manifesting in your vineyard if it's a challenge. The problem is many of us have never seen Phylloxera on grapevine roots, and that's because most of the world grows grapes on rootstock. And fortunately, if you're using a rootstock, you don't see a lot of Phylloxera on grape roots. And I think that might have been one of the challenges too for us identifying this insect as late as we did. Is it's just nobody really knows what to look for, because not many places actually have Phylloxera infestations on own roots anymore, because we've effectively eliminated the problem in many other regions of the world. So really, when you're looking for Phylloxera on roots, Phylloxera likes to feed on fine root tips. And that's what you kind of see here. That feeding causes galling. Those galls are literally perfectly shaped like mouse droppings. And you can kind of see that swelling here. And as these galls age out over the course of the summer, they turn from this creamy white to sometimes even a tint of green to black by the end of the growing season. And eventually those roots will start to rot off. And then what you're left with is just these big main structural roots in the soil without any fine roots. And that's when the plant begins to die. And again, here's an example of a kind of a phylloxerated root tip that's swollen. The challenge is, especially in the spring when you're scouting for Phylloxera, you can often find other swellings and nodules on a root. This right here is actually a massive root knot nematode egg. So there are other potential soil-borne pests that do cause damage. But note, with Phylloxera, that mouse dropping shaped enlarged root tip is really indicative of a Phylloxera infestation in the early springtime. Scouting for Phylloxera, there's a lot of steps involved with that. We do recommend doing your initial scouting in late May to mid-June, and again, kind of late August to October. Do not dig where plants are already dead, because you will not find anything except for dead roots or dying roots or more dead plants. You actually want to scout where the vines are pretty healthy, because these healthy vines have actively growing root tips on which Phylloxera will feed. So scouting here, you're not going to find anything. If you go to the healthy plants next door there, you will. Gwen and I, with the help of TJ at Good Fruit Grower, did develop a vineyard scouting video, which we would highly encourage you to watch. Gwen and I are semi-professional actors, and so I think you will really enjoy our dialogue and scripted presentation in this video. As we say, the video is professionally made by the Good Fruit Grower by very unprofessional actors. And again, step one for scouting, I'm rehashing these because I think it's a good reminder of how we approach things and looking for Phylloxera, because it can be challenging. First, look for areas of decline, and then you go to the areas next to them. That is really indicative, that's the best way to kind of hone in your Phylloxera scouting. If you have no visible areas of decline in your vineyard, I don't really have a better strategy to how to best sample than you're probably best just doing a stratified or random sampling throughout your vineyard site. Because again, it's a very pocketed, uneven distribution of this particular insect, and it's very difficult to scout if you don't have some kind of pre-symptoms in the vines. And again, vines really do start to show stunting pretty quickly. Especially in the growing season. So obviously between now and about 3 to 4 inch shoot growth, you're not going to see much of a difference. But as the water stress starts to happen and heat stress starts to happen with the vine, that's when you'll really start to notice differences between vines that have a destroyed root system versus ones that are healthy. Dig up a few roots, and again, away from those declining vines, you do have to dig, right? So this is one, bring a shovel with you. Gwen and I tend to find the best roots between about 4 and 12 inches into the soil. So get a good chunk, dig up, and honestly, just similar to how you guys sample for nematodes, go to an emitter and look for roots underneath there. So I really do recommend digging first. And really avoid those heavily damaged or already super declining vines. You're not going to find much. But once you start digging, you guys probably can't see, but we have this so you can blow up these images on the website. Phylloxera can actually be seen with the naked eye for those who have fairly decent vision. There's about 6 or 7 adult females clustered right here. Otherwise, a nice hand lens, about 20x, should help you if your vision isn't that great. But when you start to get heavy levels of infestation in a vineyard, they can be quite visible. And they are nice and gold. And again, here's those roots from before with the galls, and here's a blown up version of a little of what the females look like on the root. And then if you look up here, there's about 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we actually have some eggs on this one as well. So you'll find the adult females pretty readily in heavily infested sites. So once you find Phylloxera, what do you do? And I think the key thing, which I'm very grateful for the folks down in the Walla Walla Valley area who first found this and said, hey, I think we have an issue, is talking about it. Hiding the fact that you have it doesn't help anybody. And I think talking about it really starts to reduce the negative connotations of what it means to have a vineyard that's infested with Phylloxera. Because the more if you know, you can then plan and you can then strategize and then as an industry and as a state, we can actually move forward with action plans. So first talk with everybody who works in your vineyards. Don't hide the fact that you have Phylloxera, because there are steps that everybody needs to do to help reduce its spread, right? Restrict the movement of soil. Maybe that means those infested blocks are the last ones you now manage on your management rotation. And that might shake things up a little bit, but that's the best way to reduce Phylloxera spread. And of course, a lot of that has to do with movement, cultivating or weed management that involves heavy use of the soil. Also with harvest activities, right? So unfortunately, harvest time also aligns when there's a lot of actively moving Phylloxera. And if you have a lot of lugs and bins on the vineyard soil, that can pick up some potential contamination. When you have vines that are struggling with Phylloxera, you need to manage that vine stress. Phylloxera is already adding enough water stress to those plants. You don't need to add stuff on top. So just something to think about. And again, working in infested blocks last. And at some point, you do have to sit down and pencil out what your break-even number is in terms of vine decline and yield decline before you have to start choosing a replant option. Because that really is the only way to deal with Phylloxera, as Doug will talk about in a little bit, but there's not really much you can do to remediate Phylloxera once it's in a vineyard. Solutions, rootstocks. Doug will talk a few more, but the real solution is planting Phylloxera resistant rootstocks. Most rootstocks, or almost all of them out on the market now, have their first and foremost bred for Phylloxera resistance, and then they're bred for a bunch of other things, whether it's nematode resistance, salt tolerance, vigor, et cetera. But they are first and foremost bred for Phylloxera resistant. And I think one thing we have to think about is there's a lot of folks who are like, well, some rootstocks are better than others. Everything is better than own-rooted vinifera by multiple orders of magnitudes. No matter what you choose, it may, in some other region, they might find it to be better or worse for something or another, but it's going to be infinitely better than own-rooted vinifera. So that I think that's the silver lining to all that is anything will perform better than own-rooted vinifera relative to Phylloxera. And really, we often, people I think sometimes get because there's a lot of information out there on rootstocks. You'll read a lot of papers on the rootstock sign interaction and how that influence wine quality and blah, 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 blah. I mean, and those are all legitimate questions to ask, but ultimately what truly influences fruit quality, as we know, is management and how you deal with management, and what rootstock influences is your management approach, right? So we in Washington have a lot of control over things like water and nutrients, canopy management, et cetera. And so we can almost always outmanage a lot of the impacts that a rootstock would particularly impart on a scion, such as reduced vigor or differences in nutrient uptake. So that's something to think about, is with our use of drip irrigation out here in Washington, we can actually outmanage a lot of the other influences that a rootstock would typically have on a scion. So that's nice. But rootstocks also provide a lot of other things to help you out in a management option. So I think instead of looking at it as a concern of, oh my gosh, if we adopt rootstocks, we're going to just have a horrible time managing after cold damage, and this is just going to be absolutely horrendous for us, is to look at it as an opportunity to start to use more cultural practices in our pest and disease management programs. And rootstocks can be really helpful. Yes, they'll be a bit more challenging to deal with after cold events, but there are a lot of ultra northern cold climate regions that are growing grapevines on rootstocks and are doing just fine. We just have to tweak a couple of our management approaches. So with that, I'd really like to thank the Washington State Wine Commission for funding us in the mapping activities, and of course, giving us a little bit of cash to do some of this extension work. And of course, our good buddies at the Good Fruit Grower, who are always extremely helpful in helping myself particularly, but also Gwen and I polishing up some of our video and scouting thoughts that we think of. So they do such a great job with that. And of course, all the folks in Washington and Oregon who let us play around in their vineyards. And I think we were going to hold questions to the end. And so I will stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Melissa.
Yes, we'll hold them at the end. We have a couple in there already, but as questions come to you, just put them in the box. So Doug, as you pull up your screen, the code word to use to get your pesticide credit is April snow. One word. Something that is unusual. So take it away, Doug.
Thank you, Melissa. Am I on the right screen here?
Yes. Yep.
Okay, good. Anyway, yeah, we're all in this together. This actually was a photo we took of roots we collected down in the Walla Walla area, again in fall of 2019. And we were saddened to see that we were finding Phylloxera in more locations than originally we thought that it would be. And so, surprise. So Michelle went through a lot of the biology, history, et cetera. Phylloxera is nothing new to wine grapes worldwide. We're all familiar with how when it was introduced into Europe, it was pretty much a disaster for the European wine grape industry. They adapted. They're still growing wine grapes in Europe and quite good wine grapes. The thing about Phylloxera is that it is a native insect to North America. It co-evolved with American grape species, and hence the Vitis vinifera really never was subjected to infestations by Phylloxera in its native range of the Old World and Europe. And so when you get this novel association between a new insect pest and a new host plant, the consequences are quite negative. Phylloxera biology in many other areas of the world, it's much more complex. It can have like what we refer to as 18 different stages. There's a sexual form, which fortunately we do not have here in Washington. There's a leaf form, likewise we don't have. We really only overwhelming majority in the Western US are in the root form. That's a good thing because it does tend to help slow the spread of the pest, even though it can move, in soils and basically it's human beings that are moving the Phylloxera from vineyard to vineyard. So again, the majority of the grape Phylloxera are the adult wingless. They're generally oval shaped, but those that lay eggs are pear shaped. Phylloxera adult females in the root morph are small, just about 4/100ths of an inch long, 2/100ths of an inch wide. A little bit of variability in the color of the adult. What we've typically seen are adults of this color when we've gone out and scouted ourselves. The newly deposited eggs are yellow, oval, about twice as long as wide. The eggs transform to brown as they mature to hatch. And the first instar nymphs, the developmental stage, are what we refer to as crawlers. So just like with the great mealybug, we do believe that it's the crawler stages in which the Phylloxera are moving from vine to vine within the vineyard. Phylloxera are referred to as hemimetabolous. The immature stages are called nymphs, and they resemble the adults quite closely. They go through a series of nymphal instars. And again, to reiterate here, we believe we only have the root feeding morph in Washington state. Again, the grape Phylloxera overwinter as small nymphs on the roots. As Michelle mentioned earlier, in the spring when soil temperatures begin to exceed 60 degrees, Phylloxera start feeding and growing. And these first instar nymphs are active crawlers and may move from plant to plant in the ground or on the soil surface or by blowing in the wind. Again, probably more importantly, they can also be moved between vineyards on cuttings, boots, or equipment. Sanitation is key. These are some of the examples of the other morphs that we see in other areas. And again, the gall forming stage here is extremely rare in the Western US. As mentioned earlier, we typically only have the root feeding stage. Again, the leaf galling form is the most common in the Midwest and Northeastern US. The WSDA to date has only had one positive detect of this leaf galling form of Phylloxera, and it was at a house in Olympia on vines brought in from outside Washington. And supposedly this infestation has been eradicated. Again, going into the damage here, I think Michelle covered that quite well. Again, it's the secondary fungal infections that really cause the most damage to the plant. And that's certainly the reason for cause for concern of Phylloxera feeding on grape roots. So I think the take-home message is resistant rootstocks. And again, I should say that others have far more experience with rootstocks than I do. And for those of you with Phylloxera, your good old days of self-rooted vines may likely be over. So the bottom line is that there are some insecticides that are recommended for management of Phylloxera. Again, the take-home message here is that insecticide treatments will not eradicate Phylloxera populations. The chemical cannot easily penetrate the heavy soils that this pest prefers. And also the effectiveness of a treatment is difficult to evaluate because although many Phylloxera may be killed, populations may rebound rapidly and resume feeding on the vines. And it's also been put in the literature because it may take years of insecticide treatment to reverse severe damage. Treatments to prevent damage may be a better strategy than curative treatments. Unfortunately, and I'll mention this later, there are really only two classes of insecticides registered on grapes, and these include the neonicotinoids and the lipid biosynthesis inhibitors. And this is pure conjecture on my part, but when it comes down to it, we always have to factor in insecticide resistance. And, you know, Washington State grape growers have been on, for the most part, on a warpath against the grape mealybug, strictly because of the fact that the mealybug is vectoring the leaf roll disease. And we'd like to believe that managing the mealybug population was the best way of slowing the spread of leaf roll virus. And so, you know, after the 20 some odd years that we've been using imidacloprid in vineyards, you know, under laboratory tests in my lab, and I think for a number of you out in the vineyard, you've seen insecticide resistance occur with imidacloprid experiencing field failures against Phylloxera. So again, I have no proof, but if we'd had Phylloxera infesting the roots of these grapevines in vineyards, that may have been being suppressed by imidacloprid for the past 20 years. And you know, the reason that we may be seeing an upswing of Phylloxera infestations is that the Phylloxera have overcome this susceptibility to being killed by imidacloprid and the other neonicotinol insecticides. So when it comes to insecticides that are recommended by the University of California Integrated Pest Management Program, and again, this is not for eradication, this is just strictly for suppression of Phylloxera. They list their insecticides in their IPM website in order of efficacy and what they consider their integrated pest management fit. So their number one insecticide for treatment is, yes, get out your checkbook, is Movento foliar spray at 8 fluid ounces product per acre. And what they're recommending is what Bayer Chemical Company calls their inoculate and booster, putting out an initial treatment, waiting roughly a 2-week period, and then following that back up with a second application. Then the other primary treatments are chemigation, primarily or exclusively with the neonicotinol insecticides listed here. In their recommendations, they are recommending what I would do is to rotate chemicals with a different mode of action group number, and do not use products with the same mode of action group number more than twice per season to help prevent the development of resistance. So basically you've got two groups. You've got group 4, which is the neonicotinoids, and then you have group 23, which is Movento, which is again a lipid biosynthesis inhibitor. So not a lot new there. Where are we now? We've had a research project. Michelle went on to detail the map that their part of the program has generated. So we've been working on this for several years. We've had several project objectives. The first one is to sort of look at the pest biology in Washington State. This is basically to look for life cycle studies on endemic Phylloxera populations, quantify the number of generates per year, and validate several sample methods. We've been monitoring vineyards in Walla Walla, Sunnyside, and Zilla on a weekly basis, both in 2021 and again earlier in 2020. What we have observed is some substantial overlap of generations. At this point, we believe that there are 2 full generations per growing season. As mentioned earlier, the measurable activity declines substantially during the hot summer months when soil temperatures are warm. The Phylloxera activity increases substantially as soil temperatures decreased in September, and crawler activity migration was monitored through October. And so we're still in the process of processing our samples from September and October, but I'll show you the data that we have to date. So when it was evident to us that Phylloxera was prevalent in more vineyards than we really had accounted for, we went out and sort of did a literature search on trying to figure out how do we sample for these Phylloxera populations beyond just going out with a shovel. And within the literature, there was what was referred to as this inverted bucket as pictured here, where you basically put the bucket near the base of a suspected infested vine, leave it there for a period of time, and then collecting the buckets and then washing the contents of that bucket into a vial and bringing that vial back into the laboratory and looking at it under the microscope. And, this was sort of a technique they were recommending coming out of Australia. And, we found it somewhat cumbersome because what we found ourselves looking at under the microscope was a whole lot of sand and dust and soil particles, and really having to pick out and sort of needle in the haystack to find these Phylloxera crawlers. So we've been working with this other method that we've played around with the grape mealybug. And we basically, we're using what we're calling our 2-sided sticky tape method, where we basically have a 2-inch strip of black electrical tape. And then on top of that, we're putting a 1-inch strip of 2-sided sticky tape. And this 2-sided sticky tape is placed out in a number of these suspect vines, and it's replaced weekly. So these were our results from 2020, where we were comparing the bucket traps moving through fall of 2020 with the sticky tape method. And although on several occasions with the inverted bucket trap, we did actually capture numerically more of the Phylloxera, we were more consistently capturing the Phylloxera using the Phylloxera sticky tape. Again, this was in the 2 locations of Sunnyside and Zilla. So in 2021, we expanded our efforts. We started earlier in the season. And what we did here is we basically had Phylloxera and our standard, plus or minus our standard error, captured on the 2-sided sticky traps, tape traps per week in summer 2021. And again, as we've gone on and on about, we had that peak sort of in the earlier part of the summer. And then that dropped off quite rapidly to a point where during the hotter months of the hotter weeks of the summer, we were capturing far fewer. Again, we still have our September and October samples to process. This was a different site in Zilla, where it's quite evident here that the Phylloxera population was substantially greater than it was at the Sunnyside location. And again, we actually caught a substantial number of these Phylloxera on these Phylloxera crawlers on this 2-sided sticky tape as we removed them and brought them into the lab to count them, count the number of Phylloxera on the sticky tape samples. So this is just comparing the 2 sites. Again, we reached a peak population density in this one particular vineyard at about 30 to 35 of the Phylloxera on average per 2-sided sticky tape. But again, as we got into these higher numbers, we had a far greater variability in the number of Phylloxera caught on each sticky tape trap. And at the site in Zilla, we had periods of time where we had populations that we were capturing at or above 100 of these Phylloxera per sticky tape trap. We have another objective here, have not made much progress on it. The point of it here is one of the things that we hope to prove is where are these Phylloxera from? Are they just sort of our endemic Phylloxera that have been in Washington State for a number of years and have just spread around, or are we experiencing the invasion of Washington by Phylloxera populations from areas outside the Pacific Northwest? And a PhD student on this project will be actually traveling to Penn State, where he will be investigating this, the source or the genetics of the Phylloxera we have in the state. We've also been looking at soil temperatures via plastic mulch. And at this point, we have not really been able to manipulate soil temperatures enough to really get a treatment effect. And I always thought it was kind of be a little impractical, but I thought it was something worth investigating. We are going to continue to do this for a third year. It's more of a biology lesson for us rather than a management technique that could be used by a grower, but we would find it interesting to see if we could actually change the life cycle based on our ability to manipulate soil temperatures. I thought I could develop a bioassay method that we could test insecticides. And the bottom line here is both in 2020 and in 2021, we've never caught enough Phylloxera to test this methodology. I think, in fact, I went in and we've got a few other things we might try to do. But again, capturing enough insects in their live condition to actually run insecticides trials is certainly very difficult. We do have plans to conduct some efficacy trials, and we did conduct an efficacy trial last year. We'll also be looking at pyrethroid berm and trunk sprays and things along those lines, and then we'll also look at foliar sprays of Movento. So this was an insecticide trial that we actually completed last spring. The trial went out in June of 2021. Again, we had some experimental numbered compounds from Gowan Chemical Company. At this point, I believe this is an insecticide called Spiropydion. It's presently being registered on the big crops, corn and soybeans. And again, it's similar in the mode of activity to Movento. So it's another lipid biosynthesis inhibitor. And again, we tried several other products, Movento, Platinum, Senstar, which is a premix of 2 insecticides and obviously an untreated control. When we actually went out and used our two-sided sticky tape method, our data was, for the most part, pretty worthless because we had, basically our average count on our untreated plots was 2 Phylloxera, and most of our insecticide treatments actually had greater capture. But we are trying insecticide trials. We'll give it another try this summer. Michelle went in on length on the extension part here of the mapping tool. Hopefully this can prove to be useful for growers as they're considering their replanting decisions. And they've basically derived this map, and it is online. And I think Michelle put this up in her slideshow as well. And then it's never any good without a funny at the end. So I guess this is the point where Michelle and I would entertain any questions by the group, and hopefully we can have a lively discussion in the chat box.
Okay, I've got several questions here, so I'll just fire them at both of you. Maybe Michelle, you bring your video on. So the first one, is it possible to break the risk map down by county or even kind of AVA grouping?
Right, so I'm actually going to ask or answer Brooke's question because she's got 2 of them back to back.
Yeah.
And so Gwen can probably weigh in on this one too in the chat box if she can. But we had that question, and we chose not to because maps like these can also be used inappropriately too. But on that actual map, if you click on it, you can zoom in, and we do have county borders, so you can actually see what the risk is for various locations within your county. So it is delineated by county there. It is, but we do not have any intention on breaking it down any further. Also, if Melissa can probably weigh into this, and we had $10,000 to build that map, which is very cheap for building a tool like that. And to go to any more detail or have any kind of additional level of interaction, it will take quite a bit more than what I think was the initial ask for that particular project. So then the next question is can we map actual populations? And then the simple answer is you absolutely can map actual populations, but that would require people to be open and willing to indicate that they have Phylloxera in their vineyard. We obviously do have several internal maps within WSU, but those are shared with us with confidence, so we don't share those publicly with individuals. Also, the Washington State Department of Agriculture, with your tax dollars, does an annual Phylloxera scouting trip in October, but they can only scout sites that they have permission to go onto your site. So if you suspect you have, and so their official maps are and Doug can probably weigh into that. There's only like 2 locations in Washington that has Phylloxera, because those are the only 2 locations they've been officially allowed to scout. So if you have Phylloxera and you are willing to contribute to a greater understanding, you can allow the WSDA to do that scouting on your location. But until there's either an industry push to openly share that information, unfortunately, WSU, out of kind of grower confidence, I will not share where those mapping locations are.
Gwen, do you have anything to add? I have allowed you to talk if you want to add anything.
Michelle says it all, but thank you for allowing me to talk.
Okay.
Great answer.
Okay. Roger's got a question. When talking about harvest and tractor movement in the vineyard, how shallow will the Phylloxera be in the soil?
And so Doug can talk about when Doug's trapping, right? He's trapping Phylloxera with his bucket method that we're actually in the sticky taper that are actually moving up and out of the soil, right? So I think, Roger, that probably answers your question right there, is that these are surface populations. The soil populations that Gwen and I find when we dig are between that kind of like 4 to 12 inches, usually 8 to 12 inches in the soils where we really find a lot of Phylloxera. But Doug is trapping them, right? So in theory, Doug, they're on the surface.
Yeah, we're trapping them at a height of 1 or 2 inches up the vine, the trunk of the vine. So they're on the trunk.
Right. And in the fall, which is, I think, the major concern there is that they're moving when we are, which is an unfortunate thing.
So what impact would you think to see from last year's heat or high heat?
Oh, good question. And this will be pure speculation, Sadie. So obviously Phylloxera doesn't like high temperatures, but it's a soil dweller, right? So really the impact on Phylloxera would be how dry your soil was during those heat spikes, such that your soil temperature raised to a high level, right? I'm guessing though, probably not a whole lot of an impact on Phylloxera itself, but vines that were already struggling with Phylloxera infestation and then got hit with the heat and hit with water stress, likely declined a lot more rapidly than they would normally have. Doug, thoughts? Gwen, thoughts?
Well, I guess I would say that Phylloxera has done quite fine in Fresno.
Right.
And if you want to talk hot summers, that's every year.
Right. Soil is a great temperature buffer.
True. So if a plot is infested, vines killed and removed, how long would you think you'd have no Phylloxera? Does that make sense?
Is it?
How
I
long?
guess.
So when you're replanting,
Fallow. How long is your fallow period?
Fallow.
how long would you need to be fallow? And can you plant unrooted cuttings with 99% take but longer to get in full production, 5 years versus 4 for number 1 rooted cuttings?
I know where Paul's going with this
Yeah,
question.
could we be skeptical of rooted cuttings? Yeah.
So Doug, do you want to answer the fallow period? Because you may know more if California has tried that.
Yeah, I really don't have an answer. I would have to think it'd probably be 2 years, but I don't have a clue.
Yeah, that's kind of what we guess with nematodes too. I mean, roots can survive in the soil for up to 7 years and be viable, but Phylloxera needs actively growing roots to feed, right? So I have no idea if it goes, Doug, does it go into a diapause phase for 5 years?
No, I don't think there's any diapause.
Right. Who
So,
knows? But Paul, your question on unrooted cuttings, I'm assuming that's coming from an idea of, is that a way to reduce the risk of introduction? And yeah, Phylloxera, does move on roots, but it's usually the level of inspection that needs to happen with rooted cuttings. It's very rare for it to transfer with, at least particularly within the state and through the certification process, which requires hot dipping of roots before they come into the state. Phylloxera doesn't survive that. The real risk is when you plant plugs, essentially roots that are already bound within a soil media. That is a concern because it's very hard to hot water treat those properly. So that is probably the bigger concern. And then so that hopefully answers your question. I don't think we need to be skeptical of rooted cuttings, but we do need to be cautious when using plugged cuttings from coming outside of the state.
So if the soil at 0.3 meters is 50 degrees, what would be a good time to hunt, to look for Phylloxera?
So Doug mentioned it. 60 degrees is when they start to move. And that's honestly when we start to see it in May. Melissa, if you don't mind, I'd like to share my screen here real quick.
Sure.
A couple of things. I'm going to do my Ag WeatherNet plug here. So I don't know if you guys can see my Ag WeatherNet screen? So if you guys go to Ag WeatherNet, they do soil temperature detection on all the Ag WeatherNet stations down to 8 inches of soil, 8-inch depth, which is around that 0.3 meters. And as Doug mentioned, 60 degrees is when they start to move. They're there because they're overwintering, right? But they often overwinter probably a little bit deeper than you're willing to dig, right? So there's just the time, like, if you can spend time. But we're still pretty cold. That cold rain, cold temperatures have slowed down soil warmth. Obviously, Paul, you're in a situation where your soil is slightly warmer, but you got to remember it's where within that soil depth, and the deeper you go in the soil, the warmer that soil is in the winter, but the cooler it stays in the spring, right? Because it's a good temperature buffer. So it's probably still a little bit early if you are new to the scouting game and are looking for high populations. But if you have damaged potential spots in your vineyard, they will be there. You just may have to dig a little bit deeper. Doug?
Yeah, for the most part, as a general rule with most insects, they can move and be metabolically active, but really to grow and develop, typically 54 degrees Fahrenheit, sort of the bottom of the barrel. And they're not going to do much below 54 degrees Fahrenheit.
Okay, next one. Any effect from soils cultivation for weed management with sticky tape collection method? Too much soil sticking to the tape? Are the Phylloxera crawling up the vine out of the soil that far?
Well, certainly anything that's going to create dust is going to make the traps problematic. I don't think there was a whole lot of tillage going on in the vineyards we were working in. And, honestly, I don't really know how far up the trunk the Phylloxera crawlers are going, because we were focusing just sort of right at that soil trunk interface to see. That was kind of the obvious place to look. So, obviously, since we're not seeing the foliar form of the Phylloxera, even if they're climbing up into the canopy, they're not doing anything.
Yeah.
Yeah. We've seen with other insects, and like I said, I just went to a symposium on insect vector diseases, and there are insects that are actually using the trellis wire as sort of their freeway, most notably the Argentine ant down in California. So for all I know, they may be climbing up and using the trellis as a freeway, but I sort of doubt it.
So another thought from Paul, have you considered using a double cylinder rather than a bucket? Perhaps an 8 PVC pipe instead of a 10 inside of a 10-inch. And then you wouldn't need to remove the outer sleeve. The smaller could be belled to fit fairly snugly.
Yeah, I mean, that's probably a good thought.
Then I was under the impression that these insects were only found on the roots, yet the sticky tape capture method is obviously on the trunk. So, why are they coming out of the soil? They feed on the roots. So why do they come out of the soil?
Well, as I think we've mentioned here, it doesn't take long for these insects to kill the vines, and they need to get to new host plants. And that's just like the immature stages of the mealybug and the phylloxera. It's this crawler. That's why they're named crawlers, because that's functionally what they're doing, to distribute themselves further through the vineyard. And so that they're doing what they were designed to do. And if there's root connection within the soil, they'll move themselves through on the roots. But there's, as we're demonstrating here, there's nothing stopping them from climbing up onto the soil surface and moving themselves from vine to vine that way.
Yeah, I think that you just touched on this. Why and when do they move to the tape? So the tape is just as they're moving, looking for a new source.
With that, where we had the high abundance of the phylloxera in Zilla, we were finding these crawlers basically throughout the entire summer above the soil. If our results in 2021 parallel what we saw in 2020, we'll see another peak going into September. And then, I really thought that they would continue to remain active. And really by the time mid-October, again, this is based solely on data from 2020, once mid-October hit, there was no more movement above ground. It was strictly below the surface.
So any other questions? If we have none, now's the time to put in the chat box now your name, pesticide number, or your registration card number, and then the code word. And I will, however you spell the code word, fine. And that will conclude. We allowed plenty of time just in case there were a lot of questions. So we ran this out longer than, we knew we had the material to share. But as Michelle mentioned, there's a great website. The April issue of the Good Fruit Grower has an article on the risk map as a reminder, and that has the website location in it again.
And Melissa, the April issue of Veen also has an article on it. And I just shared my screen with the QR code for folks who want to visit that map.
Oh, great. Great.
You should just be able to hold your phone up to it and turn on the camera.
Yeah. So with that, great. I'll just keep this open a little bit longer to make sure everybody has time to get their numbers and their name and number in the chat. But that's it for our webinars for the year. The season's here, so we won't bother you. We are planning in sort of mid-July an in-person wave that will feature, I think we'll have 3 research projects that have had a research wine component. We've not had a chance to taste any of the research wines specific projects in several years now. So the idea was, we're gonna pick out some of those projects that, Marcus Keller has an irrigation Riesling project that's got a wine component. We've got a frost taint freeze effect project that's been completed. We might do smoke again. We always have a lot of smoke wines available. I think it's always good to give people an opportunity to taste, better understand how to taste for smoke. So look forward to those that date will be coming out in the next couple weeks. And with that, oh no, I still see some chat activity. So
Melissa, I also want to do a plug. We're going to have a rootstock field day on July 15th as a part of a Western SARE producer grant. So if you visit wine.wcu.edu, that's listed on our event page. Registration won't open for a little bit, but if folks just want to mark on their calendars. July 15th, rootstocks.
Yeah, and we will help promote that too.
Excellent, thank you.
So. Okay, I think everybody, I don't see any more activity. So I think everybody's had a chance. So thank you, industry. And we will look forward to the next time we can get together.
Thanks for having us, Melissa.
And this meeting was recorded, so we will have it available in case you want to revisit anything. I will send it to all those who joined us. Okay, we will end it. Thanks.